Structure, structure, structure. It's all about structure. This is a word you're going to hear a lot as a screenwriter, and in particular, the 3-act structure. The 3-act structure is the fundamentals of storytelling, and it goes all the way back to Aristotle. It's a method for analyzing, understanding, and developing stories. The 3-act structure builds your story logically and coherently with 5 key moments that are called plot points. These plot points will grab the audience and then increase the conflict and the stakes within the story, so it holds them. However, it has its limitations because it works in broad brushstrokes. It actually only gives you 5 key moments for your story. Now, you're writing a screenplay that is 90 minutes to 2 hours long. That's a lot of gaps to fill in within the story, and particularly in the second act where many screenplays fall down, because this is where they sag, lose focus, or they become downright boring because nothing is happening. To solve this problem, I'm going to detail Screenplay Method's story architecture, which is an in-depth guide to the moments your screenplay needs to be engaging, surprising, build coherently, and show the depth and complexity of your story ideas and your characters. First, let's have a look at the 3-act structure, its 5 plot points, and a variation that we see on this structure from time to time. The 3-act structure is the classic storytelling mode, where Act 1 is the beginning, Act 2 is the middle, and Act 3 is the end. Or Act 1 is the setup, Act 2 is the confrontation, and Act 3 is the resolution, but not necessarily in that order. Each of these acts are defined by plot points, and your 3-act structure will have 4 or 5 plot points. So what are these plot points? Well, they're really significant moments that throw your protagonist's world out of balance. They're revelations, they're big victories, they're big losses, they're setbacks, and they're moments when the audience and the protagonist suddenly understand what's going on in the story. It's really important though, with each of these plot points, that they happen on screen so the audience sees them and the protagonist experiences them as well. So let's go through and have a look at the 4 to 5 plot points you're going to have in your screenplay. The first plot point is the inciting incident. So we've already looked at this a little bit when we were looking at defining story. So we know this is the event that throws the protagonist's world out of balance. It has to happen somewhere in the first act, but where that happens, that's really up to you, and it depends on your screenplay. Sometimes it can be within the first couple of scenes, like within Jaws, which is when Chief Brody stands over the woman's mauled body by the shark, which is the 3rd scene of the film. Or in Stand By Me, it's also the 3rd scene when Vern turns up and says, "Do you want to go and see a dead body?" Or it could be much later in the act. Something like Casablanca, when Ilsa walks into Rick's bar. That's about 30 minutes into the story, so quite a lot has happened. Either way, it has to happen somewhere within the first act. Now, an inciting incident comes in lots of different ways, shapes, and forms. So it could be an offer, for example, in Indiana Jones, when the CIA ask Indy to go and find the Ark of the Covenant. It could be the end of something, like in Leaving Las Vegas, when Ben gets fired from his job because he's an alcoholic. In crime stories, it's when they discover that the crime has happened, either a theft, or if it's a murder, they're standing over the dead body. In love stories and rom-coms, the inciting incident is when the lovers first meet, even though they dislike each other. That's what sets their story off. It can be a call to action, like when Luke finds Princess Leia's video message embedded in R2-D2. It could be an invading force, like in Die Hard and lots of other action films, and that's when the terrorists take over the building. It could be an accident or misfortune that happens to the character. A really good example is Misery. So in the 3rd scene, when Paul Sheldon crashes his car off the road in the blizzard, that accident sets up the inciting incident for his story when he gets saved by this mysterious woman. With the inciting incident, 2 things can happen. The protagonist can react to it straight away and start to try and achieve their goals. So that would be Chief Brody trying to stop the shark from eating people. In Stand By Me, straight away they decide that they're going to go on this journey to find the dead body. Or they can be reluctant and hold back initially. So we see this a lot in Westerns are a good example. So Clint Eastwood is working on a farm and a bad posse comes to town and they beat a woman up. And then the townsfolk go to Clint because they knew that he used to be a sheriff, and they said, we need your help to get these guys. And he's like, no, I retired from that. I just want to till the fields. But we know at a point they're going to have to commit. So perhaps the guys come back to town and they murder someone. And then his conscience gets the better of him and he decides that he's now going to fight this posse. The Matrix also uses this function. The inciting incident is Neo gets a message on his computer saying the Matrix has you. He's initially reluctant to get involved, but we know when things push along that eventually he's going to have to get committed into that story. Aliens is another really good example. I think it's probably got the shortest turnaround from reluctance to commitment. The inciting incident is Burke and Gorman turn up at Ellen Ripley's apartment and they say, we've lost contact with LV-426. This is the planet where the alien was first found on in the first film. And since then it's been colonized. And they say, we've lost contact. We don't know what's happening. We're going to go there and check it out. And we want you to come along. And she's like, no way. Not only did you throw me to the wolves, it was a totally terrifying experience. The next scene, she wakes up after having a nightmare and then bang, she commits. Our second plot point is right here, and it's called the first act climax or the first act turn. So this is the second significant event that's going to happen in your story. And like the inciting incident, it comes in different ways, shapes, and forms depending on your story. So if your protagonist from the inciting incident has already set their goal, then the first act turn is going to be a big setback or a big revelation. Jaws is a good example. So this act turn is when the boy gets eaten by the shark in front of everybody on the July 4th holiday. So it's a really big setback and he tried to stop that from happening and he couldn't. If it's a detective story, we often see this event is the first break they get in the case or a revelation or a piece of information that propels that moment forward. In Seven, however, it plays a different function. This first act turn is when Brad Pitt is taken off the investigation and Morgan Freeman, despite his reluctance, has to stay on the investigation. If they haven't committed to the goal and there's been this reluctance period, this climax is the moment when they commit fully. So this is when Neo is given the choice of take the red pill or the blue pill, which is such a great moment in the film because it's good when you have this climax as a choice or decision. So he chooses to take the red pill and find out the truth about the Matrix. The first act turn plot point can also be when the character fully understands and realizes the situation that they're now in. And Misery uses this really well. The climax here is Annie tells Paul that he is a prisoner in her house and she was lying about calling his family. So he's trapped in there by himself and then she leaves. He crawls to the door and he reaches up trying to turn the knob and it's locked. So at this point, he fully realizes he is a prisoner and now he has to survive this situation. This plot point can also be a transition from one world to another or the beginning of a journey. So in Stand By Me, it's when the four boys actually step onto the tracks and start hiking towards the body to find it. In Raiders of the Lost Ark, it's when Indy gets on the flight and he flies from America to Nepal to start his search for the Ark of the Covenant. We also see it in road movies a lot. We set up the characters and the story, and the first act turn is they set off on their journey. Our third major plot point in the story is called a mid-act climax or a mid-act turn. Now, not all stories are going to have these, and if they don't, it'll still be a 3-act structure. But technically, if you have this mid-act turn, it turns your story into a 4-act structure and creating 5 plot points. So this event happens almost in the middle of the script, and it's one of those moments that really gives you that energy for the second half of the film, because this is where your story is going to sag anywhere. That's the moment that it's going to happen, this long second act. So by putting a moment in there that's really significant for the character and the story, gets the audience's interest and really propels them into the second half of the story. And again, these come in all different shapes and forms. So it could be a victory. For example, in Raiders Lost Ark, this midpoint is when Indy is in the Well of the Souls and he discovers the location of the Ark of the Covenant. It could be that a plan or many plans have failed to this point, so we need to get a new plan with even higher stakes. And that's what's important about this plot point. It can really increase the stakes. So in Jaws, everything else has failed to this point, so the three men have to get on a boat and go out into the sea to kill the shark. This is a really significant choice for Chief Brody to make because he's scared of the water. That's been set up at the start. So he's now going to face his fear not only of the water, but of the shark. This plot point could be a major setback for the character. For example, Neo in The Matrix. The midpoint is when the Oracle tells him that he is not the one. So it totally changes his perspective, and now he's not sure what's going on in the story, but later he's going to learn that he's misunderstood what she's actually said to him. It could be a change in the circumstances for the protagonist, and they'll have a sort of new goal, but it'll be attached to the original goal. And The Karate Kid's a good example of that. The mid-act climax is when Mr. Miyagi takes Daniel down to Cobra Kai, and he says to the sensei, "Stop your students from beating this kid up. I'm going to train him for this competition. We'll meet you there in a month, and we'll have it out there." So it's totally changed the dynamics, and now Daniel's gone from having to defend himself to he's going to have to compete and confront these bullies in an actual competition. Star Wars is also a good example with a revelation that shifts what the characters are doing. So the mid-act climax in Star Wars is when they're on the Death Star and they discover that Princess Leia is on there as well in the prison cells. So the goal now is, rather than getting off there, it's just going to go and save her. 7 is also a good example of upping the stakes at the midpoint. So this scene is when Brad Pitt is chasing after the serial killer, and it's that amazing chase sequence across the streets with cars smashing, it's pouring down with rain, they're jumping out of windows and down buildings, and Brad Pitt's walking past a truck and he gets smashed on the head by John Doe, who's hiding on top of it, and then he pulls his gun on him and points it at his forehead. But he chooses not to shoot him, and we're not sure why that is at this stage, but it's now made it personal because Brad Pitt's head is busted in, and now the stakes are a lot higher in that story. Alien's another really good example of using a mid-act climax to increase the stakes. It's particularly effective in action films. So what happens is Alan and the Marines have got to LV-426. There's hundreds of aliens running around, and most of the platoon has been wiped out in their first confrontation. So they're working out how they're going to get off this planet. And then Bishop comes to them at the midpoint and says, "Oh, by the way, this place is run by nuclear power and a thermal reactor is going to blow up in several hours." So now we not only have to get off the planet, but there's a race against time because they're going to get incinerated. As I said, not every film has to have a mid-act climax, and out of the films we've been looking at so far, there's no mid-act climax for Misery or Stand By Me. The next plot point is called the third act climax or the third act turn, and it'll be a second act turn or climax if you don't have a midpoint. This next significant event happens here. And again, it comes in different shapes and forms. So in detective stories, this is often a big revelation, a big break in the case. So in Silence of the Lambs, it's when Clarice discovers that the serial killer is cutting the skin off his victims to make clothing that he's going to wear himself to transition. And she also realizes that he's a tailor and he has these skills with his hands. So that becomes a crucial piece of evidence to go and find him. Chinatown's another great detective story that uses this revelation, and it's the great scene with she's my sister, she's my daughter. So the character now has an understanding of what's going on, big revelation, but they still have a problem that they need to solve. This plot point can also be an all is lost moment when everything else has failed and it looks like the hero has lost. So this happens in Matrix. It's the moment when Morpheus is taken by the agents and they're going to hack into his mind and get the code to the Matrix, so they're going to have to kill him, his own team, to stop this from happening. But Neo says, "No, wait, I'm going to go back in and I can save him." So in this moment, he makes that choice and they're going to confront the problem with a new plan, and that gives us that really significant shift. So there's no going back. We're pushing further into the story and we're now committing to a dangerous plan because it's really risky. Jaws also uses this upping the stakes with a new plan, and what happens at this climax here on the third act is that the marine biologist is going to go down into the water in his flimsy cage, and he's got a dart on the end of a stick that's got poison in it. Now, the shark has nearly trashed the boat, so it's a huge risk for him going down into the water, and we're not sure whether he's going to survive or not, but all else has failed up to this point. 7 uses a really interesting function for its third act turn. In this moment, it's not that the detectives get the big revelation on the case. The killer gives themselves up to the detectives. It's an absolutely thrilling moment, and it completely disorientates and shocks the audience and the protagonist, because it's like, why has he given himself up? We're going to find out in the last act why that is, but that's an example where you can fulfill the requirements of a 3 or 4 act structure, but give them in a very fresh and original way. So these ideas are not ones you have to stick to slavishly. You can find your own variations and revelations within them, and the audience absolutely loves when you do that successfully. Our final plot point is the climax and resolution of the story. This is the scene where we find out if the protagonist succeeds or fails in their goal. So in detective stories, this is when they solve the crime and slap the handcuffs on the criminal, or in the case of 7, they actually fail because Brad Pitt falls into the devious plan that John Doe had all along. Or it's a battle or big confrontation. So it's when Neo has to face off with Agent Smith. And in The Karate Kid, it's when Johnny and Daniel fight each other. So the 2 main rivals come together, and we're going to see who's going to win that moment. These one-on-one fights as the climax are very common in action films and superheroes, where the hero and the villain have a final confrontation, but it's very rare that the hero will lose this one. Misery also uses this function where there's a fight between Paul and Annie at the end, and Paul has to kill Annie in order for him to survive. It also can be a decision that the characters have to make in this moment, and Ghostbusters is a great example at its climax. So the Ghostbusters realize the only way they can defeat Gozer is to cross the streams, which means they might die, but they're going to have to do that to save the city. Some climaxes are great when it is both a physical confrontation and a tough choice. And Stand By Me is a really good example. So there is the physical confrontation between the 2 gangs, of which our protagonist wins, but then he makes the difficult choice to call in the body anonymously, and he's not going to be famous, which was his original goal. But it's a really interesting moment because he's matured, and we've seen the physical and emotional victory of our main character. In monster films, this is when the hero kills the monster. So Ellen kills the alien, Chief Brody kills the shark. This moment can also be when an item is delivered, like the ring in Lord of the Rings, or an item is retrieved. So we see that in Jason and the Golden Fleece, and also in Raiders of the Lost Ark, in that final moment when Indy tells Marion to close her eyes and not look at the spirits. And this is the moment when they win the Ark to take back home with them. Now, no matter how you play this scene out with all the different variations and options you have, it has to be a completed ending. So we need to know what the outcome of that story is, and we need to see it. We don't want to watch a film like Jaws and then it get near the end, and then we cut back to the beach and Chief Brody comes running up. He says, "Oh my God, you should have seen it. I just killed the shark." We need to see them in that moment and winning or losing, and how they go about winning, or what happens to lose in that scenario. Now, final word on these plot points. It's really important that they swing between negative and positive. All your plot points can't be negative or down events, and they also can't be all positive or up events. This is how we're taking the audience through an emotional roller coaster ride of different emotions and experiences. So you want your film to start to look like this. We're going down to a negative, then it's a positive at the midpoint, then we have a negative at the 3rd act climax, and then it becomes a positive with an up-ending story. So that's the rough structure that will work in. Sometimes you'll see where you've got, it's a negative and a positive, another positive and a negative. Or if it's a down-ending story, it works the opposite. So we've got a positive, negative at the midpoint, positive at the 3rd act turn, and you know whenever you're watching a film and there's a positive that happens around here, then your protagonist is in big trouble. So normally get that as a down ending climax. So we see this in 7 and Chinatown. They're both examples where we have the big revelation, which is a step forward as a positive at this turn, and then it's a negative climax. Whereas Silence of the Lambs, it's one when they get the big break, and then it's a positive climax there. So it stays elevated. But this climax scene is so terrifying that we're gripped within that moment. A variation we see on this is the 2-act structure film. These 2-act structure films have 3 plot points, and they are the inciting incident, a midpoint, and a story climax. So they're our 2 acts. And the problem with these types of stories is there's not enough events to happen through to keep the story really tight and the audience engaged and interested. And also it gives us less of an experience of 3 distinct parts of a story. Some examples of 2-act films are Full Metal Jacket. So the first act of the Marines training, and the second act is the Marines fighting in Vietnam. Or another way to look at it, it is from disorder to order and order to disorder. Mad Max Fury Road is also a 2-act story. So the first act is them escaping from where they've been imprisoned, and at the midpoint they decide they need to turn around and go back to where they're imprisoned because that's where the water is. Essentially the first act is a 1-hour car chase in one direction. The second act is the same car chase but reversed, them heading back. However, this script has a huge amount of action sequences and amazing car chases and explosions, and it's got so much energies. That's what keeps us interested all the way through the story. Another variation on this actually isn't a variation, it just appears to be, and that is taking the 3-act structure and using non-linear storytelling. So this is when you move the events and orders of the scenes around to create a new story time frame. An example of this would be Pulp Fiction. And what this technique does is it actually is, we've got our 3 acts. And what it does is it takes this act turn back and puts it in the opening scene. In Pulp Fiction, this is when Honey Bunny and her boyfriend are sitting in the diner talking about how they're going to pull their guns out and rob it. Then we move through the story, and when we get to this moment, the scene reappears, but the context now changes in the scene. We now have new meaning. In Pulp Fiction, that's when we discover that Vincent Vega and his partner are also in that diner at the same time, and then the context plays out different in this act. Another great example is Beau Geste, which was made back in the early 1930s and one of my favorite films. That has the opening scene, is the second act turn, but it starts here. We move all the way through the story, then we learn what the meaning of this incredible opening scene is. Another variation on that we sometimes see is the first act turn is used at the start. And American Sniper is a good example. So Bradley Cooper's opening scene got a gun on top of a building in Baghdad, and a kid and his mother comes out and they're wondering, does he have a bomb strapped? And he has to make this choice of shooting him or not. So that's our opening scene. Then we flash back to when he meets his wife and before he's a Marine, and then he does all of his training, and then we come back to this moment. And then we see the repercussions. Will he or won't he shoot the boy? That use of non-linear storytelling is a really good way to get the audience's mind jumping around so they think something's happening and then that perspective changes. And it's quite an exciting moment when it plays out well because the penny drops and the audience is like, oh, that's what's been happening. The way to structure that story is to organize it in a linear fashion and then break up and move your scenes around.